Romans chapter 1. Martin Luther, the great leader of the Protestant Reformation, he studied the book of Romans for years before he felt compelled to start what became the Protestant Reformation. And he said this about the book of Romans. He said, Romans can never be read or pondered too much. And the more it is dealt with, the more precious it becomes and the better it tastes. The book that we're studying right now as a community is a book that is in many ways inextinguishable. Every time we come to the book of Romans, if we come with fresh eyes and with a fresh mind and with open hearts, it comes to us and it devastates us. Part of the reasons why we're studying this as a community is that if we are honest with ourselves, for far too many of us, we experience a kind of Christianity and we are engaging a Jesus that really is much more superficial than who the real person is. That we are following a kind of Christianity that is lightweight, that is paper thin. We've seen this in this city. We've seen this in people's lives here in this church, tragically, where little hang-ups come up here and there, and because what they understand about the gospel is so thin, is so light, they've just stayed on the surface, that they're easily swayed. And they move away and they get distracted. And so as a community, we are going headlong into a book that is perhaps the most in-depth, strongest, meatiest book in the entire Bible. We're going into this book that throws us right into the guts of the Christian gospel. It's a book that from time to time you will find yourself hopefully getting lost in God's glory in. It is from time to time difficult to follow, and yet it's not the book's fault, it's our fault, because the gospel is so big, it's so magnificent, it's so multifaceted that sometimes it's hard to wrap our hearts and our minds around it. So let me give you a little bit of background to this book of Romans that we've been preaching through for the past couple of weeks, but let me tell you a little bit, first of all, about the author of the book of Romans. Romans was written by a person, his name is Paul. He later became known as the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul was, eventually became probably the most important sort of missionary of the early Christian church. He helped to start a lot of churches in the known sort of world of his day, and he wrote several of the books that are now in our New Testament. However, the Apostle Paul did not start out a Christian. He actually started out and began his career as someone who hated Christianity. He was a fierce opponent of Jesus, a fierce opponent to anyone who believed in Jesus and trusted in him. And yet, while he was fighting against Christianity, something strange happened. He actually came into an encounter with Jesus himself. And he had the opportunity to see Jesus for who he is. And he did what I think many people would do if they just saw Jesus on his own terms. Paul changed his mind about him. He not only changed his mind about him and admitted that he was wrong about Jesus, but he actually changed his life and he began to follow Jesus. And he dedicated his life to this person whom he hated and had persecuted for much of his life. Paul later became known not just as an apostle, but he became known as the apostle to the Gentiles. The word Gentile is just a word to describe everyone who's not Jewish. And he became known as the apostle of the Gentiles because he became really good at explaining how Jesus was not just the king of the Jews. You see, Paul was Jewish, And Jesus and his followers, they were all Jewish. But Paul became really good at explaining that Jesus wasn't just relevant to Jewish people and relevant to people who already had an attraction to Judaism, but he was actually relevant to every human. That Jesus was actually not just the King of the Jews, but he was the world's true Lord. So he explains his life mission this way in Romans 1:5. You'll see it here. Here he's explaining sort of his vocation as now an apostle. He says, through Jesus, we have received grace. That is, he was able to come to know Jesus and get forgiven. So he received grace and apostleship. What was he going to do with that apostleship? To bring about the obedience of faith for the sake of his name among all the nations. All the nations, not just Israel. And so what Paul is doing in Romans is to explain why it is that this obscure Jewish rabbi who lived in an obscure country, in an obscure part of an obscure country, why this Jewish rabbi who got himself crucified like many other people did, why is it that he is relevant to every human on earth? And he explains how it is that this Jewish intra-religious movement became a movement that speaks to all nations, regardless of where you come from and regardless of what your religion may or may not be. He does something else too in this book. He throws into our laps a problem. And it's just a problem that we have to deal with. And it goes like this. We have two basic responses that we as humans have always sort of leaned on to the reality of the existence of God. He's going to explain in a minute that every human has some sort of revelation of that there is a God and that he's out there. And yet what Paul is going to do in this book is he is going to say that the two basic responses that we are used to the reality of God, that both of those responses don't work anymore. One of the response is to see God for who he is and then simply not to like him. And to shake our fist at him and to run away from him and to do things we know explicitly he doesn't want us to do. We call that sort of irreligion. And we talked about some of the expression of that last week. But it's simply classic rebellion and God, I know you're there, but I'm going to run away from you as fast as I can, and I want to do what I want to do, period. Some of you maybe have responded in that way to the Lord, and some of you, perhaps that's where you are right now. Others of us respond in a different way, and Paul actually falls in this camp. That is, the response to the reality of God is a very religious one. You know that there's a God who's out there somewhere, and so you try to order your life so that you follow all the rules that are given to you as best you can so that somehow your life will measure up and that this God, whoever he is and wherever he is, that he might be pleased with you. And this was Paul's experience. He worked very hard to do everything right. And Paul, in chapter 2 of Romans, is going to say that even our best religious efforts come up short. Because there is something wrong within our hearts that doesn't allow us to respond to God properly, even in our religious efforts. And so he's going to strip away the basic ways that we respond to God. He's going to say that the irreligious way doesn't ultimately lead to life. It leads to death. And that the religious way, ultimately, it doesn't lead to life either. And instead, he presents before us a message. This message that he later would simply describe as the gospel. Paul believed that we live now in a new era because of what Jesus has done, the historical person who lived and walked on this earth, that because of what Jesus has done, not just his life and his death, but especially his resurrection, that we live in a new era where faith, i.e., what it is that we put our trust in, but sometimes we see it, sometimes we don't see it, where faith and history, what's observable and seeable in the world, what actually happens in the world that you can observe, that faith and history have actually now come together and have now merged climactically in the historical resurrection of Jesus. You see, Jesus' followers, they were very sad to see him get crucified. But other would-be messiahs had been crucified previous, and you know what? They would have gotten over it. They would have picked another messiah, they would have moved on, and yet something dramatic actually happened that changed the mind of Jesus' own followers. And that something is that Jesus actually, literally rose from the dead. And it convinced them so strongly. They believed this was God's climactic event in human history, that started this movement of explaining to people who Jesus is and what he did and how he reconciles us to God. And so Paul explains in the very beginning of the book of Romans how the resurrection gets this thing started. And so look at Romans chapter 1, verse 1 through 4. Here's Paul. He says, Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle, set apart for the gospel of God. And so what is this gospel? This good news, which he promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures. So there's history to it. God knew this was coming. Concerning his son, Jesus, who is a descendant of David according to the flesh, and was declared to be the Son of God in power according to the Spirit of holiness by his resurrection from the dead, Jesus Christ, our Lord. And so the resurrection of Jesus is the event that sets all of this into motion. And so for Paul, he sees his job as being this, to explain to us why it is that this event and the message around it is the most important thing we could ever hear, and that it is fundamentally good. And what we're going to see today is Paul in chapter 1. This is our last sermon in chapter 1. We'll move to chapter 2 next week. That Paul in chapter 1, he is going to say that we need to be prepared for the gospel. That there's actually something that he believes that all humans have to acknowledge in our own hearts, in our own world. There's something that we have to acknowledge in order to come to the point that we can really receive the gospel and understand the comprehensiveness of it. So Romans chapter 1, verses 19 and 20. We're just going to look at these two verses. For what can be known about God is plain to them. Them here is all of humanity. You, me, everyone. What can be known about God is plain to humanity. Why? Because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world and the things that have been made, so that they are without excuse. What Paul is saying here is that there is a universal human story that we all share. Regardless of where you come from, regardless of what tribe, religion, tradition you come from, that there is a universal story of humanity that we all share in. And that part of what we share in as humans in our story together is that God has allowed himself to be known by us in certain ways. And that he has allowed himself to be known by us in certain ways to the point that we are without excuse before him. That God in his goodness has shown himself, has revealed himself, and we're going to figure out exactly how, in such a way that at the end, when we stand before him, that no one could accuse God of being unrighteous in judgment. That when all the facts are played out in judgment, Paul says, God stands vindicated and righteous because all of us, all humanity, have been shown a bit of who God is. You guys like good food? Denver right now is having some kind of renaissance because it seems like every week there's some new restaurant that opens. And by the way, this is going somewhere, so just hang on with me. And Renee and I, we can't keep up with all the new restaurants, but we just love going to these new restaurants, and they're so yummy. And our kids right now are beginning to get into the act. They have an 8-year-old, a 5-year-old, and a 2-year-old. They have begun to distinguish between what it is that I provide for them, i.e. mac and cheese and PB&J, and what it is that mom cooks for them, i.e. things that are really yummy. And let me tell you about something that happened in our household 2.5 months ago. A family in our church had a baby, and Renee, during this day, she decided to cook for them a meal. And so she spent a lot of the morning and kind of the noontime cooking this meal. And it was a meal, our kids, they call it pizza, mixed between pizza and pasta. It's just basically Italian awesomeness, all kind of rolled into one, and it smells amazing, tons of garlic and butter. Anyway, my kids love it. They go crazy for it. And this is how it kind of played out that day. Renee spent all the morning and noontime cooking and preparing this meal. House flooded with the aroma of this meal. Then she boxes it up, and then she goes and drives it over to this family's house that's just had a baby. While she is gone, my boys arrive from school. They come into the house, open the door, and immediately, pizza, where's the pizza? And it was funny because they went to the kitchen and they see all of the remnants of their favorite meal. They see all of this sort of external evidence that there is their favorite meal somewhere. They can smell it in the air. And yet they can't find it anywhere. Now, I am home with them. And my boys are faced with a dilemma. Do we wait for mom to get back to give us something that's legitimate? Or do we settle for what my dad can provide for me, which is PB&J? They settled for the PB&J. There is a reality of God's presence, of his existence in the world. We see the remnants of it here and there. We can even smell it in the air. We know it's there, and yet the universal human story is that even though we know there is something wonderful and big and awesome out there, we settle for something that is less. One theologian put it this way. He says, "Our memory of God accompanies us always as a problem and a warning." And what Paul does in verse 19 and especially verse 20 is show three ways in particular that God has revealed himself to us that point to us about his existence and leads us to a problem that we know that he is there and yet we have settled for something less. The first thing we see mentioned is that God reveals himself in nature itself. What can we note about God, verse 19, is plain to them because God has shown it. How? For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power, divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world. In what? In things that have been made. Things in creation itself. As Coloradans, we are a privileged group of folks that we have access to some of the most stunning bits of God's creation on earth. A 25-minute drive gets us right into some of the most gorgeous places on earth. And yet every time we go camping and spend time in nature, we in our souls know that this is telling us something about God. You guys ever been to REI? Now, REI has become, now I've been in Denver now for 7 years, and so I'm ashamed to tell you this, but I haven't actually ventured outdoors much. And only recently, as in 3 weeks ago, did I have my first camping outing, and come to find out there's something to it. It really is fun. And sure enough, nature's really pretty and great. I have my 3 kids. They seem to have a great time with it. And yet what's so interesting as you study kind of a camping nature culture that we have in this city and in this state, you even hear people say things like, I go to nature to have church. And what I've seen a lot of people get caught up into is a part of this reality that Paul is talking about, is that there is a sense in which you go into nature and you have access to some things about God that are real, that's legitimate. And yet Paul says that always comes up short. It's like going into a kitchen that smells really good and yet there's no food in it. Later, it's always a matter of time before that guy comes. Later, Paul would, at the end part of his ministry, he actually went to Athens. And Athens was the intellectual capital of the world in antiquity, and still a pretty impressive place intellectually. And yet that was sort of the capital of the world. And it's funny because when Paul went there, he began to engage with philosophers of all sorts. And what he noticed was that these philosophers were doing the best they could at that point, realizing this reality. That in nature, God has let himself known, and yet he pointed out to them that they were settling for far less. And he explained to them this sort of dilemma that they were in. It's in Acts 17, 26 and 27, if you want to look it up later, where he said, guys, God has made from one man every nation of mankind to live on the face of the earth, having determined the allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, so he's created human society and then nature sort of to help and provide for human society as well, so that, verse 27, they should seek God in the hope that they might find their way toward him, feel their way toward him and find him. Yet he is actually not far from each one of us. Here he's bringing to mind the imagery of someone who is in a house who is blind. It's dark. And they're frantically searching for a door. They know the one's out there. They know there's a way out, and yet they can't just seem to find it. They search and they grope and they feel the way toward them, and yet they're hopelessly in the dark. Paul says that's part of the human story. That's part of the reality of humanity living in reality of the divine. And we see this in nature. We also see this not just in nature and camping and out in the woods, but we see this when we begin to look up out into the sky and begin to contemplate the universe itself. Notice what Paul says here. He says, I can find it. He says, for his invisible attributes have been clearly seen. And what are his invisible attributes? His eternal power and divine nature. Now, this is sort of an oxymoron that Paul is providing for us, because if something's invisible, can't see it. And so how is it that we can see something that is invisible? What Paul says is that when you look into the universe, into the existence and our own existence, and especially as you look out into the sky, you begin to see something that we can only describe as eternal power and only attribute a characteristic that would only be appropriate for divinity. It's interesting. In preparation for this sermon, I've been doing a lot of reading about physicists, and in preparation for this sermon, I read a book by perhaps the most sort of famous and most respected physicist in the world. Where is it? Stephen Hawking. And he wrote this book. It's actually a pretty short book called A Brief History of Time. And what's so interesting about what Stephen Hawking does, and part of what he does in these theoretical physicists, he's sort of in the line of Einstein and folks like that, is that they try to unlock sort of the mysteries of the universe and think about black holes, and they think about the origin of how it is, what it is that led to us being here today. And they try and think through of those things really carefully. And what's so interesting is that in this book, as I began to read through it, began to hit me that this is a book about God. And it's interesting that God kept coming up over and over and over again. And Stephen Hawking, he's not a Christian. He doesn't have any sort of obvious religious bias one way or the other. And yet, what studying the universe does is it thrusts us into a context in which we can only begin to explain it using categories that are appropriate for God. Eternal power. How is it that this world came into existence? There must be some kind of enormous power behind it. Divinity. This thing has to be omnipotent, has to be all over everywhere. And he starts using words like God. It's interesting that two of his colleagues at Cambridge University, and these are two of the top theoretical physicists in the world as well. They were studying with him, or colleagues with him, and they were doing some of the same things he was doing and beginning to try to understand the Big Bang theory and how it is that the universe came to existence. Now, by the way, I know nothing about physics. All of this is this past 2 weeks, and so just FYI, in case there's a real physicist here. So I'm doing the best I can to explain this. But what they were doing is they were trying to understand the context of the universe that allowed for life to happen. Okay, you got it? What these two colleagues of Hawking discovered was that the universe, in order for life to be at all possible, there had to be, for lack of a better word, tinkering involved. Almost as if there was some fine-tuning happening. And for these guys, this was actually a very upsetting discovery. After all, they're world-famous physicists at Cambridge. And we have a quote here from one of these guys who, John Polkinghorne, who became a Christian and actually retired his post at Cambridge and became a pastor. And here he describes a conversation that he and Fred Hoyle had when they began to discover this fine-tuning idea of the universe. He puts it this way, this is John talking. He said, when Fred saw that and realized that, he said, the universe is a put-up job, which is a Scottish way of saying it's been designed. It's a put-up job. In other words, this cannot just be haphazard. There must be something lying behind this. And of course, Fred does not like the word God, so he said there must be some capital I intelligence behind what is going on in the world. What these guys are discovering, what Stephen Hawking continues to battle with, is what Plato battled with when he taught that there must be a divine, invisible reality behind the known material world. It's behind what the psalmist and the writer of Proverbs said way back 3,000 years ago, that the beginning of wisdom starts with the fear of God. And so God shows himself to us in nature. He lets us see a part of who he is when we contemplate the existence of the universe. And he also shows us who he is if we honestly begin to look at our own soul. You see that you and I, we are part of that which has been made in creation. That we are a part of this creation. And an honest evaluation and look into our own soul brings to light the fact that there is an existence that we long to experience that is nevertheless short of what we actually experience. That there is something in our soul that is just off, and we know it's off because we know that something's amiss, and yet we never can quite seem to find it. Several years ago, is that me who's doing that? That noise? Are you getting any feedback? Okay. I hear something, so I just want to make sure it's not me. That's fine, whoever that is. No worries. Just making sure that it's not me. We love kids. Loving that loud noises. We're all for it. Several years ago, in fact, before Renee and I moved here to help start Fellowship, we lived in Cambridge. And I studied there, and I wasn't in the physics department at all. But I studied, I was a fellow in historical Jesus studies. And so I spent years researching the history behind the historical person of Jesus, what he said, what he did, life, resurrection. And one of the books I came across was written by this guy. His name is I.N. Wilson. He wrote a book on Jesus, and he was kind of a typical sort of skeptic. He was friends with Richard Dawkins at Oxford, was a running buddy with him, and was just sort of a pretty well-known atheist who was trying to debunk sort of the history behind Jesus in particular. He wrote this horrible book on Jesus that was not any good, but anyway, that was him. Come to find out, I was actually really surprised to find out that 2 years ago, he wrote and confessed that he actually believed in God. And that for 30 years, he was fighting against God and certainly against Jesus in particular. For 30 years, he'd done that. And then 2 years ago, he wrote his testimony, if you will, of what it was like for him to leave atheism and begin to engage in this person of Jesus again. And what was interesting is that a part of his journey had to do with an honest examination of his own soul. I have a part of what he wrote up here, and we'll read this. And he had just been talking about Richard Dawkins and some famous atheists that he ran with. And he said, yet the real category mistake made by atheists is not really about God, although that's certainly the case, but about human beings. Read the first chapter of Genesis without prejudice, and you will be convinced at once. The Lord God formed man out of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. And man became a living soul. He ends by saying, materialism will never explain those last words. That there was a reality pressing on him that was real in his own soul that eventually he couldn't get away with. He came to the realization that St. Augustine came to when he finally gave in and allowed God to be God. When he said in prayer to God, "You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our heart is restless until it rests in you." What Paul wants us to realize is that we are all, the human story is the story of the prodigal son. That as humanity, we have strayed away from our Father. And yet, we are still haunted by a distant memory of him. Though we know he is there, we shut him out. We respond to him in various ways that replace him with other things. And yet he is there. It's interesting that the word in Hebrew scriptures to describe God most often is described simply, I am. He is here. Well, Paul says that there is a universal reality to this, that every human, regardless of where they come from, engages with. And they choose to replace him for something far less. So in light of what Paul's doing here, how are we to respond? If he already said we shouldn't respond irreligiously and we shouldn't respond by just getting really religious, how is it that we respond? The first thing I think he would have us do is simply quit fighting. Quit warring against God and allow him to be him. For many people, the next step is simply to admit that this is true and quit your fight against it. This is a universal human struggle that if you continue to fight against the reality of God, you actually lose a part of your humanness and your createdness. And if you quit fighting, you are then left with being in a position where God wants you, a position of real, honest, true crisis, in which the reality of our situation before God is felt. C.S. Lewis, the famous writer, he describes the moment when he quit fighting against the reality of God. And he describes it this way. He says he'd been atheist for some time and was at Oxford. And he says, "You must picture me alone in that room night after night, feeling, whenever my mind lifted for a second from my work, the steady, unrelenting approach of him who I so earnestly desired not to meet. That which I greatly feared had come at last upon me. In the Trinity term of 1929, listen to his language, I gave in and admitted that God was God and knelt and prayed. Perhaps that night, the most rejected and reluctant convert in all of England." And so part of what Paul wants to do in preparing us for the gospel is simply to get us to the point where we quit warring against the reality of God. And we see him and allow him to be simply who he is. And allow our hearts to tremble at the reality that we stand before him. And we stand before him without excuse. The second thing after we quit fighting, Paul wants us to do in response to this is simply this. Look to Jesus. Look to Jesus. Now, some of you may say, why Jesus? I mean, if God is this universal, omnipotent being that's a reality, I mean, there's a whole sort of plethora of religious figures we could point to. Why is Jesus so important? I mean, couldn't we get lots of good insight about God from other religious leaders? Well, yeah, of course you can. This is why Paul wants us to look specifically to Jesus, that Jesus has something unique about him that no other religious leader has, and it's this. Jesus is the only one who faced our universal human foe, which is death. Death is the final arbiter of us all. There is a one-to-one correlation between people who have lived and people who have died. It is the thing that is always pressing in on us, and we realize the moment that we are born, we know there will come a time when we will die. It's part of what it means to be human. And yet, something in us knows that there's something wrong about that. There's actually something unnatural about death. And Jesus is the only one who faced death. He faced a real gruesome death on a cross via torture. And he died and he was buried. And he's the only one in human history to have faced death, to have gone through death, and then quite stunningly come out on the other side, beating death. This came to quite a shock to Jesus' own followers. They certainly did not understand his predictions about resurrection, and when he died, they bolted. They were out. When someone dies on a cross, it means you are cursed by God, not the Son of God. That was in their thinking, and so they bolted. And so something happened that so changed them that they became convinced that Jesus was in fact God's Messiah, God's Son, who had been crucified. And the thing that happened is that Jesus literally, physically, historically rose from the dead. He beat death. And because he beat death, he stands alone as someone that we ought to listen to. And because he beat death, now we go and look at his life and we realize some things that he said that are pertinent to this discussion today. One of the things that he said was that if you have seen me, you have seen the Father. That this God, this unknowable God who is out there, strong, powerful, and yet unknowable, this thing that has been so far from us, Jesus believed that in him we could see God. We can begin to have real access and insight into who this Creator is, into who our Creator is. Which means he has insight into your life, into my life, that no one else has. He not only gives us a glimpse at who God is, he also believed that his life had a particular purpose that he believed he had to die. If you read about his life in the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we see that all of his life is geared toward this necessity that he must die. He must give up of his life. And when he's on the cross, he gives us insight as to what he's doing. He, on the cross, cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Jesus actually experiences, he believed for us, the separation that we often feel from God. Jesus took that upon himself. The distance that we have from God, Jesus believed in his death. He takes that distance in himself. That distance is a sign of punishment, of judgment, because we've rejected God. He takes it into himself. And then when he rises from the dead, he begins to claim that he now has given us access to this real God that every human on the planet has had to deal with. And so there is a reality of God's existence in our lives so that all humans are without excuse. Paul wants us to sit in that reality and experience a bit of a crisis of standing before a holy God with no excuses, subject to his judgment, knowing that his judgment would be right. And then Paul wants us to quit fighting against that reality and finally to look to Jesus. That Jesus is unique among everyone who has ever lived. That he has something unique to say about who God is, and that he believed that if we have trust in him, we can experience what is called a new creation. We can experience something that's called a new birth, where distance from God is no longer a felt reality, but rather we get to call God our Father. And he calls us his sons and his daughters. Pray with me. Father, it is our prayer this morning that we would come to realize your ever-present reality among us. That if we look into our soul, we know there is evidence of you. If we look into nature, we see remnants of your existence. And even if we look into the skies and begin to contemplate our own existence, we know that it has an origin in you. And God, I pray that we, as a community, would do what the psalmist instructed us to do, which is simply be still and know that He is God. Father, I pray you would now turn our attention to Jesus. That in him, we get to see the very face of God. And we begin to experience restoration with the one who made us. God, it's my prayer that each person in this room today would get to experience that kind of restoration, that kind of reunion with you. We pray this in Christ's name. Amen.